The fake bride walked into Ashford Estate wearing a borrowed wedding gown, and every powerful person in the room forgot how to breathe. For one long second, the grand hall went silent except for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the rain brushing against the tall windows like nervous fingers. Crystal chandeliers burned above polished marble floors. White roses climbed the stair rails. Silver trays moved between guests dressed in black silk, navy suits, pearls, and quiet judgment. At the front of the room stood Julian Ashford, 35 years old, billionaire owner of Ashford Hotels, a man whose name could move markets before breakfast and fill ballrooms before sunset. He wore a midnight blue suit cut perfectly to his shoulders, his dark blonde hair neat, his blue eyes cold enough to make most people lower their voice. Beside him stood Caroline Vale, his arranged fiancée, graceful in champagne satin, one hand resting lightly on his arm as if she already owned both the man and the empire. Everyone had gathered to watch Julian publicly confirm the engagement his family expected. His board approved, and Caroline had been chasing since the first charity gala where she smiled at him like he was not a man, but a locked door she knew how to open. Then the double doors at the far end of the hall opened. A young woman stepped inside. She was not Caroline. She was not anyone the Ashford family recognized. Emma Bennett stood beneath the doorway light in a wedding dress that was a little too long, a little too loose at the shoulders, beautiful in the way borrowed things can look heartbreaking. Her honey blonde hair had been pinned quickly, loose strands falling near her flushed face. Her fair skin looked pale against the white fabric. Her hands trembled around a small bouquet she had clearly not chosen herself. On her neck hung a delicate pressed flower pendant, simple, old, and completely out of place among diamonds. A murmur moved through the guests like wind through dry leaves. Caroline's fingers tightened on Julian's sleeve, but her smile did not falter. In fact, it grew. Small, sharp, victorious. Julian felt it before he understood it. The shift in the room. The sudden heat of humiliation. The way cameras from the family press table tilted toward the doors. His grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, wrapped in a cream shawl, her silver hair shining beneath the chandelier. She had been smiling only moments ago, pretending this engagement gave her peace. Now her smile faded. Her eyes moved from Emma to Julian, then to Caroline. Something in Eleanor's face tightened, not from anger, but pain. Emma saw that pain. She had been told to look straight at Julian, say the line, ruin him, take the money, and leave. She had repeated it in the back of the hired car until the words tasted like metal. I am the woman he promised to marry. I am the bride he hid from all of you. That was the line Caroline had paid for. That was the lie that would save Emma's little brother's surgery deposit. That was the lie that had brought her here in a dress that smelled faintly of dry cleaner plastic and someone else's perfume. But standing in the doorway, looking past the guests, past the flowers, past Caroline's perfect smile, Emma saw Eleanor lift one shaking hand toward her heart. The old woman did not look angry. She looked wounded on behalf of a grandson she loved. Emma's stomach turned. This was not a rich man's party anymore. This was a family about to break in public. Julian stepped forward first. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous only because it refused to shake. Who are you? Emma opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Caroline gave a soft gasp, flawless and false, pressing one hand to her chest. Julian, she whispered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. What is this? The room leaned toward him. Judgment arrived before truth did. Emma looked at Julian then, really looked at him. Not the billionaire in headlines. Not the cruel man Caroline had described. Not the predator of poor girls. She saw the way his jaw tightened when his grandmother's breathing changed. She saw his hand move half an inch toward Eleanor before he stopped himself, trapped by the eyes of the room. She saw, beneath the icy composure, a man who had been betrayed before and had learned to bleed quietly. Emma's fingers closed around the bouquet until the stems bent. I am sorry, she said. Her voice was small, but in the silence it carried all the way to the chandeliers. Caroline's smile flickered. Excuse me? Emma took one step forward. The borrowed hem dragged over marble. I was supposed to say something else. A ripple passed through the guests. Julian's eyes narrowed. Supposed to? Emma nodded, and shame burned across her face. I was hired to come here tonight. Caroline went still. Julian did too. Eleanor's hand remained at her chest. Emma forced herself to keep speaking before fear could drag her backward. I was hired to wear this dress, walk into this room, and tell everyone that Mr. Ashford had secretly promised to marry me. Gasps broke across the hall. Someone dropped a champagne flute onto a tray with a sharp, bright clink. Caroline recovered quickly, turning toward Julian with wet eyes that appeared too fast. This is disgusting. She is lying. Emma looked at her, and the last of her fear became something steadier. No, she said. I was lying when I walked in. This is the first true thing I have said all night. Julian's gaze moved from Emma to Caroline. The air around him seemed to harden. Caroline gave a wounded laugh. You cannot possibly believe this stranger over me. Emma stepped closer, her voice trembling but clear. I was paid to destroy him, but I cannot do it after seeing your grandmother cry. The words struck the room like a bell. Eleanor closed her eyes. Julian turned toward her, and for the first time that evening, his perfect mask cracked. The billionaire looked less like a king in his estate and more like a grandson who had almost watched the last person who truly loved him get hurt by a lie. Caroline's face changed, just for a breath. Anger flashed through the beauty. Emma saw it. Julian saw it. And Eleanor, old as she was, saw everything. Then Caroline stepped forward, smiling again. But this time the smile looked like a blade hidden under silk. "Security," she said softly. "Remove this woman before she invents another story." But before anyone could move, Julian raised one hand, never taking his eyes off Emma. "No," he said. "She stays." 72 hours earlier, before Emma Bennett stood under chandeliers in a borrowed wedding gown, before Julian Ashford raised his hand and told the whole room she would stay, Caroline Vale sat in a private lounge on Newbury Street with a cup of untouched tea and a plan sharp enough to ruin 3 lives at once. The lounge was all velvet chairs, marble tables, and quiet piano music, the kind of place where wealthy people whispered over problems other people could not afford to have. Caroline wore ivory wool, pearl earrings, and a calm expression that had taken years to perfect. Across from her, her cousin Meredith slid a folder across the table and lowered her voice. "Julian is going to end it." Caroline did not blink. "He said that." "Not directly, but Ashford Legal requested a review of the engagement documents this morning. Eleanor has been asking questions too." At the mention of Eleanor, Caroline's fingers tightened around the teacup. She had worked too long, smiled too gracefully, endured too many family dinners where old money judged her like an applicant, only to be dismissed because Julian suddenly wanted sincerity. Sincerity. The word almost made her laugh. Men like Julian Ashford could afford to call it love because their bank accounts protected them from consequences. Women like Caroline had to call it strategy. "He does not get to walk away and make me look disposable," she said. Meredith leaned closer. "Then give him a scandal before he gives you silence." Caroline looked through the tall window at the city street beyond, where pedestrians hurried under gray afternoon clouds. A florist delivery van had stopped by the curb. A young woman stepped out carrying a crate of white roses, her honey blonde hair pulled back, her coat too thin for the weather. She lifted the crate carefully, paused to help an older woman pick up a dropped glove, then rushed through the service entrance of the event building next door. Caroline watched her with sudden interest. "Who is that?" Meredith glanced out. "Probably staff." Caroline smiled. "Exactly." By late afternoon, Caroline had a name. Emma Bennett, 27. Part-time florist assistant. Occasional. Event server. White. From Lowell. No wealthy family, no press record, no social circle that could protect her. A younger brother named Noah at Boston Children's Hospital, waiting for surgery that insurance had delayed and bills had made worse. Caroline read the brief report in the back seat of her car while rain blurred the windows and the driver moved through traffic. Desperation, she had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it wore tired eyes, sensible shoes, and a polite smile while carrying flowers into rooms where one centerpiece cost more than a month of rent. That evening, Emma found Caroline waiting outside the florist's shop just as the sky turned purple over the rooftops. Emma had worked since 7 in the morning. Her hands smelled of stems and cold water, and her phone held 3 missed calls from the hospital billing office. When Caroline introduced herself, Emma recognized the kind of woman who did not enter places like that by accident. "Miss Bennett," Caroline asked with a practiced warmth. "I am sorry to approach you this way. I heard you sometimes take private event work." Emma hesitated near the shop door. "I do, but I am booked most weekends. This would be one evening. Very simple, very well paid." Emma should have walked away. She knew that later. She knew it even then, in the small warning that moved through her chest. But then her phone buzzed again, and the hospital number glowed on the screen like a verdict. Caroline saw her glance at it. Her voice softened. "It is for your brother, is it not?" Emma's eyes lifted quickly. "How do you know about my brother?" "I know how unfair medical bills can be," Caroline said, as if the sentence cost her sympathy instead of research. "And I know a man who deserves to be exposed." The next morning, Caroline brought Emma to a quiet cafe near Beacon Hill, where the coffee was served in porcelain cups and Emma felt ashamed of the mud on the edge of her boots. Caroline placed a cream folder on the table between them. Inside was a short contract, a cashier's check, and a photograph of Julian Ashford standing beside Eleanor at a hospital gala. "His name is Julian Ashford," Caroline said. "He is powerful, charming when he wants to be, and very good at making poor women believe they matter." Emma looked at the photograph. Julian did not look cruel. He looked distant, guarded, maybe sad. "What did he do?" Caroline's mouth tightened in a way that looked almost convincing. "He has a habit of making promises privately and denying them publicly. Tomorrow night, his family will announce our engagement. I need you to walk in wearing a wedding dress and say he promised to marry you first." Emma pulled back. "That is not true. Truth is complicated when men like him control the room." Caroline pushed the check slightly closer. "This covers your brother's first deposit. There will be more after the event." Emma stared at the amount. Her throat closed. It was more money than she had seen in one place in years. Enough to stop the calls. enough to let Noah sleep without hearing her whisper apologies outside his hospital room. Her hand moved to the pressed flower pendant at her throat, the tiny white blossom sealed behind glass. Her mother had made it when Emma was 16, after selling flowers outside a church fair in the rain. When you have nothing, her mother had told her, your name is still yours. Do not trade it cheaply. Emma looked from the pendant to the check. I would have to lie in front of his family. Caroline leaned in, voice low and poisonous with sympathy. You would be telling the kind of truth women like you are never allowed to tell. He will survive embarrassment. Your brother may not survive waiting. That was the sentence that broke Emma's resistance. Not because it was fair, because it was cruelly close to the fear she carried every hour. She signed with a trembling hand, each letter of her name feeling heavier than the last. Caroline smiled then, soft and victorious, and slid a garment bag toward her. The dress is inside. Car will pick you up at 6. Say only what is written. Cry if you can. Leave quickly after. Emma nodded, but as she stepped back onto the sidewalk with the dress over her arm and the check hidden in her bag, the cold air hit her face and shame followed close behind. Across the street, a church bell rang 6 times. Emma stood there under the gray sky, holding the price of her brother's hope in one hand and the shape of another man's destruction in the other, not yet knowing that one glimpse of an old woman's tears would change everything. Emma Bennett did not go home after signing the contract. She went straight to Boston Children's Hospital with the cashier's check folded inside an envelope, pressed flat against her chest beneath her coat as if someone might see the shame through the fabric. The hospital lobby smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and winter rain dragged in on people's shoes. Parents sat under fluorescent lights with tired faces, holding stuffed animals, insurance papers, paper cups, prayers they did not say out loud. Emma moved through them like she belonged to that quiet army of people who had learned to look calm while their hearts counted bills. On the 6th floor, her little brother Noah was sitting up in bed, thin shoulders under a blue blanket, a comic book open on his lap. He was 17, old enough to understand more than Emma wanted him to, young enough to still smile when she walked in with a paper bag from the diner downstairs. You brought fries, he said, brightening. Emma held up the bag. Doctor-approved emotional support fries. Noah grinned, then studied her face too carefully. Did something happen? Emma forced a smile as she sat beside him. Something good. I got some extra event work. The deposit is covered. For a second, Noah just stared at her. Then his eyes filled with a hope so pure it almost broke her. How? She looked down, smoothing the blanket near his hand. A private party. Rich people. They pay too much for everything. He laughed softly, but the sound faded when she did not laugh with him. You are not doing anything bad, right? The question landed with the weight of a door closing. Emma touched the pressed flower pendant at her throat. Her mother's tiny white blossom rested against her skin, warm from her body, delicate as a memory. I am doing what I have to do, she said, and hated how close it sounded to a lie. Noah reached for her hand. Mom used to say that if a choice makes you hide your face, it is probably not the right one. Emma looked at him quickly. Mom also used to say family comes first. She said love comes first, Noah whispered. Not fear. Emma could not answer. She stayed until visiting hours ended, laughing at his terrible jokes, arranging his blanket, pretending the envelope in her purse was a miracle instead of a price. But when she stepped back into the hallway, the guilt followed her like a second shadow. That night, in her small apartment in Lowell, the wedding dress hung from the bathroom door because there was nowhere else to put it. The room was barely wide enough for a bed, a chipped dresser, and the folding table where she made flower arrangements for extra cash. The dress looked absurd there, glowing white under a cheap ceiling light, surrounded by thrift store mugs, unpaid bills, and a laundry basket with one broken handle. Emma unzipped the garment bag with trembling fingers. The gown slid out in a soft whisper, satin and lace meant for a woman who had chosen love, not a stranger who had been hired to counterfeit it. She tried it on because Caroline's instructions said she had to check the fit. The mirror over the dresser showed a version of herself she barely recognized. White gown, pale face, red-rimmed eyes, the pressed flower pendant still visible at her throat because she could not bring herself to take it off. For one strange second, she imagined walking into a real wedding, toward someone who looked at her as if she was wanted, not useful. Then she saw the contract on the table and the dream vanished. She picked it up and read the lines again. Enter through the main hall at 7:15. Approach the front aisle. State clearly that Julian Ashford promised marriage before the public engagement. Remain emotional. Leave when instructed. Do not contact the Ashford family afterward. Do not speak to media except through Caroline Vale's representative. The words were neat, clean, professional, and poisonous. Emma placed the contract beside the cashier's check receipt and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the gown. Rain tapped against the window. Somewhere upstairs, a baby cried. Across the street, a neighbor's television flickered blue. Through the curtains, Emma whispered into the empty room. I am sorry. She did not know whether she was speaking to Julian Ashford, her mother, or the girl in the mirror. The next morning, Caroline called 3 times before Emma answered. You sound tired, Caroline said. Do not be tired tonight. You need to look fragile, not exhausted. Emma closed her eyes. I want to ask you something. Quickly. Are you sure he deserves this? Silence. Then Caroline laughed softly, as if Emma had asked whether winter deserved snow. Men like Julian do not deserve or not deserve. They survive. You are not ruining him. You are correcting a story he has controlled too long. And his grandmother? The line went quiet again, this time colder. Eleanor Ashford is not your concern. But for some reason, the way Caroline said it made Eleanor feel like the only honest part of the story. By late afternoon, a black town car waited outside Emma's building. She carried the dress in its bag, her flats in a tote, and her mother's pendant against her chest. The driver did not speak. The highway unrolled beneath a heavy gray sky as they left Boston behind and headed toward the wealthy quiet of the Connecticut estate country, where stone walls bordered long driveways and houses sat far back from the road like secrets. Emma watched bare trees past the window and tried to repeat the line Caroline had given her. I am the woman he promised to marry. I am the bride he hid from all of you. But every time she reached the word bride, her throat tightened. When the car turned through the iron gates of Ashford Estate, she saw the mansion rise ahead, golden windows shining through the rain, white roses being carried under covered walkways, valet attendants in black coats moving like shadows. Emma stepped out before the driver could open her door, needing air, needing one last moment to decide whether she could still run. Then, through a side window near the garden entrance, she saw Julian Ashford for the first time, not as a photograph, not as Caroline's warning, but as a man kneeling beside an elderly woman in a cream shawl, gently adjusting the blanket over her knees while she touched his cheek. With shaking fingers, Emma froze with the wedding dress over her arm, because the cruel billionaire she had been paid to destroy was looking at his grandmother like she was the only safe place he had left in the world. Emma did not move for several seconds. She stood just outside the garden entrance with the wedding dress bag over one arm, rain misting her hair, her breath shallow in the cold Connecticut air. Through the tall side window, Julian Ashford was no longer a headline, no longer a billionaire carved from ice, no longer the kind of man Caroline had painted in cruel colors. He was kneeling beside Eleanor's chair with one hand gently tucking a cream blanket over her knees. The grand hall behind him glowed with chandeliers, flowers, and quiet wealth, but he seemed unaware of all of it. His attention belonged only to the elderly woman in front of him. You are cold, he said softly. Emma could not hear every word through the glass, but his voice carried just enough. Eleanor smiled at him, tired and loving. I am old, Julian. There is a difference. He almost smiled back, but it did not reach his eyes. You promised me you would tell me if you felt weak. And you promised me you would not marry someone just because everyone thinks she looks right beside you. Julian looked down at the blanket. The words seemed to enter him slowly, like something painful and familiar. Tonight is not about me. Eleanor touched his cheek with trembling fingers. That is what worries me. Emma's throat tightened. She looked away, but the image stayed with her. A powerful man bending low so an old woman would not have to lift her voice. A grandson trying to protect the last soft place in his life. It did not fit Caroline's story. It did not fit the contract. It did not fit the lie Emma had been paid to speak. A side door opened behind her, and a young woman in a black staff uniform hurried out carrying a tray of empty glasses. She nearly bumped into Emma and gasped. Oh, I am sorry. Are you with the bridal party? Emma froze. Something like that. The staff member glanced at the garment bag, then at Emma's pale face. Her expression softened. First big event? Emma nodded, before she could stop herself. You will be all right, the woman whispered. Everyone in there looks important, but they are just people who need water refills and directions to the restroom. The kindness was so ordinary it hurt. Emma thanked her, then slipped inside through the service corridor before she lost the nerve to move at all. The hallway smelled of roses, candle wax, and polished wood. Staff passed with trays. Somewhere beyond the walls, a string quartet tuned softly. Emma found the small dressing room Caroline had arranged for her, a room meant for coats and emergency tailoring, not a conscience unraveling. The wedding gown waited inside like an accusation. She changed with shaking hands, trying not to look at herself until the last button was done. When she finally faced the mirror, she saw a bride built out of fear. The dress was beautiful, yes, but it did not belong to her. The satin pulled slightly at one shoulder. The hem brushed the floor. Her shoes were plain white flats from a discount store. Around her neck, her mother's pressed flower pendant rested against the gown, the only honest thing she wore. She touched it and whispered, "What do I do, Mom?" No answer came. Only the muffled sound of applause from the hall as guests began gathering for the announcement. Then Caroline entered without knocking. She shut the door behind her and looked Emma up and down with quick, assessing eyes. Good, Caroline said. You look innocent. That will help. Emma turned from the mirror. I saw him with his grandmother. Caroline's face remained smooth, but her eyes sharpened. And he was kind to her. Most men are kind when someone is watching. He did not know I was watching. For the first time, Caroline's patience cracked. Emma, listen to me carefully. You are not here to evaluate him. You are here to do a job. She opened a small clutch and removed a folded card with the lines printed in black ink. You walk in when the doors open. You stop halfway down the aisle. You say exactly this. Julian Ashford promised to marry me before he promised himself to Caroline Vale. Then you cry. If you cannot cry, look down and let people imagine the tears. Emma stared at the card. The words looked uglier now than they had in the cafe. His grandmother is not well. His grandmother has survived richer scandals than this. That does not make it right. Caroline stepped closer, her perfume sweet and cold. Do you know what is not right? A 17-year-old boy waiting for a hospital to decide whether his life fits inside a payment plan. Do you want to return the check? Emma flinched. Caroline saw it and pressed harder. Because I can stop it before it clears. One call. Then you can go back to begging billing offices for mercy, while men like Julian drink champagne under chandeliers. Emma's eyes burned, but she held Caroline's gaze. You said he hurt women like me. He has hurt people by existing above them, Caroline said. That is enough. It was not enough. Emma knew it now. Maybe she had known from the first moment and had only been too frightened to admit it. Caroline handed her the bouquet. 7:15. The doors open. Do not forget why you are doing this. When Caroline left, Emma stood alone in the small room, the card in one hand, the bouquet in the other. Outside, the music changed. A staff member knocked once and whispered, Miss, they are ready. Emma looked at the card again, then at her pendant. Her brother's face rose in her mind, hopeful and scared. Her mother's voice followed. Love comes first, not fear. Emma folded the card in half, then again, until the lie was small enough to hide in her palm. She stepped into the corridor. At the far end, beyond the double doors, hundreds of wealthy guests waited to witness a ruin Caroline had designed. Emma could still earn the money. She could still say the line. She could still walk away. But as the doors began to open and the light from the grand hall spilled across her borrowed dress, Emma made the first honest choice of the night. Julian's words cut through the grand hall with such quiet force that even the security men near the doors stopped in place. Emma stood halfway between the entrance and the front of the room, still clutching the crushed card in her palm, the borrowed wedding dress whispering around her shoes whenever she breathed. Caroline's smile held for 1 second too long, then trembled at the edges. Julian, be reasonable, she said, keeping her voice soft enough to sound wounded. This woman walked into our engagement celebration dressed as a bride and made a disgusting accusation. She is clearly unstable, or paid by someone who wants to hurt us. Emma lowered her eyes. Paid. The word was true, and because it was true, it burned worse than any lie. Julian noticed the flinch. So did Eleanor. The old woman sat near the fireplace, one hand resting on the arm of her chair, her face pale but alert. The room had become a courtroom without anyone admitting it. Every guest watched Julian, waiting to see which woman he would believe. The polished fiancée whose name belonged on invitation cards, or the stranger in a borrowed gown who looked as if she might break under the weight of her own honesty. Julian stepped down from the front of the room and walked toward Emma. His movements were measured, controlled, but his eyes were sharper now. Who hired you? Emma swallowed. The answer sat in her throat like a stone. Caroline gave a delicate laugh behind him. You cannot be entertaining this. Julian did not turn around. I asked her a question. Emma looked past him at Caroline. The woman's eyes were no longer smiling. They warned, threatened, reminded. The check, the contract, Noah's surgery deposit. Emma's fingers rose to the pressed flower pendant at her throat, and for a moment she was back in the hospital, watching her brother grin over cold fries, asking if she was doing anything bad. I was hired by Miss Vale, Emma said. A wave of sound moved through the guests. Caroline's face emptied, then filled instantly with disbelief. That is insane. Emma forced herself to continue. She told me Mr. Ashford was cruel. She said he had hurt poor women before and would deny it unless someone exposed him in front of his family. She gave me a script, address, money. Lies, Caroline said louder now. All of it. Emma unfolded the small card in her shaking hand. It was creased where she had crushed it, but the words were still readable. Julian took it from her carefully, as if even a lie deserved to be handled without cruelty. His eyes moved across the printed sentence. His jaw tightened. This is the line you were supposed to say? Emma nodded. Yes. Why did you not say it? The question was not accusing. That made it harder. Emma looked toward Eleanor, and the entire room seemed to follow her gaze. Because I saw you with your grandmother before I came in. You were kind to her when no one important was watching. And she looked at you like she was afraid this night would cost you something she could not repair. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. A tear slipped into the fine lines beside her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. Julian saw it, and something in him shifted. For years, he had been trained to stand still while people negotiated around his name. Board members wanted his signature. Relatives wanted stability. Caroline wanted status dressed as devotion. But this stranger, this frightened woman in a gown that did not fit, had looked into the machine of his life and seen his grandmother's heartbreak before her own escape. Caroline stepped forward, her satin dress catching the chandelier light. How touching. She studies a room for 5 minutes and suddenly understands your soul. Emma turned to her. No, I understood enough to know you lied to me. Caroline's eyes hardened. You took the money. Yes, Emma said. The word was barely above a whisper, but it did not hide. I did. My brother is in the hospital. I was scared. I let fear make me easy to use. The honesty landed differently from the scandal Caroline had planned. It did not make Emma look innocent. It made her look human. Julian looked at the pendant resting against the borrowed gown. Your brother. Emma nodded. Noah. He needs surgery. I thought if I took the money, I could fix one thing in my life. But I was about to break something in yours. The guests shifted. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked ashamed. As if they had first seen Emma as entertainment and only now remembered she had a life outside the doorway. Caroline seized the pause. There. She admitted it. She came here for money. She wore a wedding dress into my engagement announcement for money. And you are all listening to her like she is some moral hero. Julian finally turned to Caroline. She admitted what she did. Caroline lifted her chin. And I deny what she says. That is the difference, Julian said. The words were calm, but Caroline recoiled as if they had found their mark. Eleanor's voice came from the fireplace, fragile but clear. Julian. Everyone turned. The old woman motioned toward Emma with 2 fingers. Bring her closer. Julian hesitated. Grandmother, you should rest. I have rested through enough lies in this family. The sentence silenced even the whispers. Emma moved carefully toward Eleanor, the hem of the gown trailing over marble. Up close, Eleanor looked smaller than she had from across the room, but her eyes were bright with the kind of authority age earns by surviving disappointment. She studied Emma's face, then the pendant at her throat. What is your name, child? Emma Bennett. And are you still willing to lie for the money? Emma's eyes filled. No, ma'am. Even if telling the truth costs you? Emma thought of Noah, the hospital bill, the check that might not clear if Caroline stopped it. She felt fear rise so sharply she almost could not breathe. But beside the fear stood something steadier, something her mother had planted long before desperation tried to uproot it. Yes, Emma said. Even then, Eleanor reached for her hand. Emma froze, startled by the warmth of the old woman's fingers against hers. Caroline's face flashed with panic. Eleanor, please. You are letting this girl manipulate you. Eleanor did not look away from Emma. No, I am letting her finish. Then she turned to the room, her voice low but carrying. Dinner will be served in 20 minutes. Miss Bennett will stay. Caroline will stay. Julian will stay. And before anyone leaves this house tonight, I want to know which woman entered this room wearing a costume, and which one entered it telling the truth. The dinner table at Ashford Estate looked less like a place to eat and more like a stage built for judgment. Long white candles burned in silver holders, their flames reflected in crystal glasses and polished forks placed with military precision. The dining room, stretched beneath a painted ceiling, with portraits of Ashford ancestors staring down from dark frames, as if the family had been summoned across generations to witness the disgrace. Emma sat near the far end of the table in the borrowed wedding gown, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the pressed flower pendant resting against the white fabric like a small, stubborn truth. She felt every eye on her. Caroline sat across from her in champagne satin, composed again. Her beauty sharpened by anger she refused to show fully. Julian sat beside Eleanor, close enough to notice whenever his grandmother's breath grew uneven. But his gaze kept returning to Emma as if he was trying to solve a question no one had ever asked him before. Servants moved quietly with soup and warm rolls, but the room had no appetite. One of Julian's uncles, a broad man with silver hair and a voice used to boardrooms, set down his spoon without tasting it. Miss Bennett, he said, making her name sound like a mistake on formal stationery. Are we expected to believe you walked into this house wearing a wedding dress because your conscience suddenly improved? Emma lifted her eyes. No, sir. I expect you to believe I made a bad choice before I made a better one. A few faces shifted, not with kindness but with surprise. People often prepared themselves for excuses. They rarely knew what to do with accountability. Caroline gave a soft laugh. How poetic. She should have gone into theater instead of blackmail. Emma flinched, but did not look away. I did not blackmail anyone. You accepted money to create a scandal, Caroline said. Let us not decorate it. No, Emma answered quietly. Let us not. The table went still. Julian looked at her more closely. There was fear in her face, but no performance. She was not trying to look innocent. That made her harder to dismiss. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching both women with tired eyes that missed nothing. Tell us about your brother, she said. Emma swallowed. The question was gentle and somehow that made it hurt more. His name is Noah. He is 17. He has been sick for a long time, and the surgery deposit was more than I could cover. I work at a flower shop during the day and serve events when I can. I sold my car last month. I thought I could keep up if I just worked harder. Her voice thinned, but she steadied it. Then the hospital called again. Miss Vale knew about the bill. She knew the amount. She knew exactly where to press. Caroline's eyes flashed. I offered help. Emma turned to her. You offered a lie and called it help. A faint murmur passed down the table. Caroline smiled as if amused, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. You signed the contract. Yes. Emma's answer came immediately. I signed it because I was scared and desperate. That is my shame. But you wrote it because you wanted to hurt him. She looked at Julian only briefly when she said him, as if afraid her apology might sound like a plea. Julian felt that restraint more deeply than he expected. Most people who wanted something from him learned to hold his gaze, to make their need intimate, flattering, impossible to ignore. Emma did the opposite. She kept taking responsibility in a room where everyone else was trying to move blame around like a chess piece. Caroline leaned back. This is absurd. She is turning poverty into a halo. Emma's cheeks flushed. There is no halo in being poor. It is hard. It is humiliating. It makes every envelope feel like a threat. But it does not make lying beautiful. I know that now. Silence followed. Even the staff near the sideboard looked down, moved despite themselves. Julian's uncle cleared his throat, less certain than before. And yet you took the money. I did. Where is it now? Emma's fingers curled in her lap. The check was deposited this morning. The hospital has not used the funds yet. I called from the dressing room before I walked into the hall and asked them to pause the payment if possible. If it has cleared, I will pay it back. Caroline laughed sharply. With what? Flower petals and moral speeches. Julian's voice cut in for the first time since dinner began. Enough. It was not loud, but every candle seemed to steady. Caroline looked at him, startled by the coldness in that single word. Julian turned back to Emma. Why did you call the hospital before you entered the hall? Emma hesitated. Because after I saw you with Mrs. Ashford, I knew I might not be able to say the line. I thought if I still went through with it, at least I should not let the money be spent before I understood what I was doing. Eleanor's hand trembled near her water glass. Emma noticed before anyone else did. Without thinking, she stood, the wedding gown shifting around her legs, and reached for the glass. May I? Eleanor looked at her, surprised. Emma poured a little water, then glanced toward the nearest server. Could you bring warm tea, please? Something light, and maybe a little honey if she takes it. The server looked to Julian for permission, but Eleanor answered first. Honey would be lovely. Caroline's lips curved with contempt. How convenient. A performance of tenderness right when everyone is watching. Emma froze with the glass in her hand. Julian's face hardened, but Eleanor spoke before he could. Caroline, my dear, I have been watched by people for almost 80 years. I know the difference between someone acting concerned and someone forgetting herself because another person is uncomfortable. Caroline's expression tightened. The room listened. Eleanor took Emma's hand briefly before letting go. Sit, child. Emma sat, shaken by the kindness. Julian looked at his grandmother, then at Emma, and something inside him changed from suspicion into reluctant respect. This woman had entered his house as a lie, but every minute since then had cost her more truth than most people at that table had offered in years. Then the dining room doors opened. A young assistant in a dark suit stepped inside, moving quickly toward Julian with a sealed folder in her hand. Her face was pale with urgency. She bent beside him and whispered, Mr. Ashford, legal found the revised engagement documents. You need to see this before Miss Vale says another word. Julian did not open the folder at once. He kept his hand on the sealed edge while the entire table watched him, and for the first time that evening, Caroline looked less like a woman defending her honor and more like someone listening for a lock to turn. The assistant, Claire, stood just behind his chair, breathing carefully, eyes fixed on the polished floor. Emma sat frozen in the borrowed gown, one hand still near Eleanor's water glass, unsure whether the new evidence would save her, condemn her, or expose something worse than anything she had already admitted. Julian broke the seal. The paper inside was crisp, official, and marked with Ashford legal review notes in dark blue ink. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second. His face did not change dramatically. That was what made it frightening. The colder Julian became, the more everyone understood that the room had moved beyond gossip. Caroline lifted her chin. Whatever that is, I should see it too. Julian looked at her then. You will. He placed the first document on the table. This is the revised engagement agreement sent by your attorney yesterday morning. Caroline gave a tight smile. Standard protections. You know how these families operate. Everyone protects themselves. This clause transfers voting rights from my personal Ashford shares into a marital trust after 6 months. The table went silent. Julian's uncle leaned forward sharply. Caroline's smile thinned. A temporary trust. That is common. Claire quietly handed Julian another page. He read aloud, voice measured and low. Upon medical incapacity or voluntary withdrawal by Julian Ashford, trustee authority passes to Caroline Vale as primary marital representative. Eleanor's hand stilled on the arm of her chair. The candles seemed suddenly too bright. Julian looked up. My grandmother has been ill. You knew I had considered stepping back from daily operations to spend more time with her. Caroline's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, then away. Do not twist this into something ugly. You already did. The words landed without heat, but Caroline flinched. Emma felt the room shift again. This was no longer about her wedding dress or her lie. It was about power, inheritance, and a woman who had planned for weakness before anyone else even admitted it existed. Caroline reached for her glass but did not drink. My attorney drafted aggressive terms. That is what attorneys do. Julian turned one more page. Your attorney also attached a payment record. Caroline's face went pale beneath the chandelier light. Claire closed her eyes briefly, as if she hated what was coming. Julian placed the page beside Emma's folded script card. A wire authorization to Emma Bennett, arranged through a consulting account tied to your foundation. Caroline said nothing. Meredith, seated 2 chairs down, shifted as if trying to vanish into the high-back chair. Eleanor noticed. So did Julian. And there is one more thing, Julian said. His voice changed on that sentence, not louder but more personal. He took out a small printed photograph from the folder and slid it toward Caroline. A copy of the identification badge Emma used at the florist delivery entrance yesterday. You requested her by name before she knew you existed. Emma stared at the image. There she was in her work coat, holding a crate of roses, unaware that her desperation had already made her visible to someone hunting for leverage. A cold shame moved through her, followed by anger so quiet it almost felt like clarity. Caroline had not helped her. Caroline had selected her. Eleanor looked at Emma, and the tenderness in the old woman's face deepened. Child, she said softly. She found your pain and called it opportunity. Emma's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Not yet. Caroline stood. This is outrageous. All of you are acting as though I did something Julian's own family has not done for generations. You arrange marriages, protect wealth, merge names, preserve power, and when I learn the rules better than you expected, suddenly I am the villain. Julian rose slowly. You are not wrong about this family's sins. That answer startled everyone, including Caroline. But tonight you tried to ruin an innocent woman, frighten my grandmother, and trap me inside a legal cage while calling it love. Caroline's voice sharpened. And what about her? She pointed at Emma. She still signed. She still put on the dress. She still walked through those doors. Emma stood before Julian could answer. The gown dragged softly against the floor. She is right. The honesty cut through the rising noise. Emma reached behind her neck and unclasped the pressed flower pendant. The tiny white blossom rested in her palm, fragile under the chandelier glow. My mother made this for me after a church flower sale in Boston. She told me that a person can lose money, comfort, even pride for a while, but if they sell their name, it takes a lifetime to buy it back. I forgot that because I was afraid. Eleanor leaned forward, eyes suddenly fixed on the pendant. Where did your mother sell flowers? Emma blinked. St. Matthew's, near Back Bay. Years ago. She sold small bouquets outside charity lunches. Eleanor's breath caught. Bennett? She whispered, as if the name had just opened an old door. Rose Bennett was your mother? Emma stared at her. You knew her? Eleanor's eyes glistened. She gave me white violets the day my son died. I had no cash in my purse, and she said grief should not have to pay for flowers. The room softened around that memory. Even Julian looked shaken. Emma closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling her mother suddenly present in the most impossible room. Eleanor reached out, and Emma placed the pendant gently in her palm. Your mother had dignity, Eleanor said, and so do you. Not because you made no mistake, but because when truth called your name, you answered. Caroline looked from Eleanor to Emma, realizing with horror that the poor girl she had hired as a disposable scandal had become the only person in the room Eleanor trusted. Then Julian's phone vibrated on the table. Claire glanced at the screen and her face changed again. Mr. Ashford, she said carefully. Boston Children's just confirmed the payment was reversed before processing. Emma's knees nearly weakened with relief and dread at the same time. Noah's deposit was gone. Her lie had not bought his surgery. Her conscience had cost him the only miracle she had. Julian saw the pain strike her face and stepped forward, but Emma stepped back first. No, she whispered. Please do not fix this with money. Not tonight. Then she looked at Caroline, at Julian, at Eleanor, and at the entire Ashford family staring from both sides of the table. Her voice was small, broken, and steady all at once. I need to leave before I become another thing rich people argue about. Emma's words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like someone trying to save the last clean piece of herself before the room swallowed it. She turned from the table, the borrowed gown trailing behind her like a mistake made visible, but Eleanor reached out with one trembling hand. Wait! Emma stopped. Not because she owed the Ashfords anything, and not because she expected mercy from people who could buy solutions before breakfast. She stopped because Eleanor's voice carried the weight of a woman who had just remembered kindness from another lifetime. Julian stepped toward Emma, careful and slow, as if one wrong movement might make her disappear. Emma, Noah's surgery does not have to depend on Caroline's money. Emma closed her eyes. There it was, the offer she feared most because part of her wanted to fall to her knees and accept it. She could picture Noah in the hospital bed, pretending not to be scared. She could picture the billing office, the paused payment, the phone call she would have to make in the morning. She could picture freedom arriving with Julian's signature, wrapped in guilt. Please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If you pay for him tonight, then every cruel thing she said about me becomes easier for this room to believe. Julian looked as if the sentence had struck him somewhere deeper than pride. Caroline gave a cold laugh, too relieved to hide it. How noble. She refuses money now that everyone is watching. Eleanor turned her head slowly. Caroline, sit down. The quiet command carried more force than shouting would have. Caroline remained standing, but her confidence had begun to fray. Her perfect hair, her satin dress, her diamond bracelet, all of it suddenly looked less like beauty and more like armor that no longer fit. Julian picked up the revised engagement agreement and placed it in front of her. This is over. Caroline stared at the papers. You cannot mean that. I do. Because of her? She pointed at Emma, but her voice cracked on the last word. Julian did not look away. Because of you. The dining room fell into a silence that felt final. Caroline's eyes glistened, but it was hard to tell if the tears came from heartbreak, humiliation, or rage at losing what she had planned so carefully. I loved the life we could have had, she said. Julian's face softened with sadness, but not surrender. I know. That was the problem. Claire stepped forward to collect the documents, while Julian's uncle quietly instructed Ashford Legal to suspend every pending engagement arrangement. No one celebrated. No one smiled. It was not a victory. It was a door closing on a future that had never been built with love. Caroline looked around the table, searching for someone to defend her, but the family she had tried to enter now saw her clearly. Meredith would not meet her eyes. The older relatives stared at their plates. Eleanor looked tired, not triumphant. You all think you are better than me, Caroline said, her voice shaking. Eleanor answered softly, No, dear. Tonight has shown us that we have not been good enough either. That sentence changed the room more than Caroline's downfall did. Julian looked at his grandmother. Emma did too. Eleanor's eyes were wet now, not with weakness, but with recognition. We taught our children to protect the name, Eleanor continued. We forgot to teach them that a name without kindness is only noise. Emma felt the tears come then, sudden and unwanted. She pressed the bouquet against her waist and turned away, but Eleanor spoke again. Rose Bennett gave me flowers when I had nothing to give her. Tonight her daughter gave this family the truth when we did not deserve it. Emma shook her head. I am not like my mother. You are more like her than you know. Emma looked down at the wedding dress, at the satin she had not earned, at the hem gathering dust from the floor. Slowly, she reached behind her shoulder and loosened the small clasp that held the delicate lace cape Caroline had added to make the gown more dramatic. It slipped into her hands. She folded it once and placed it on the table beside the script card and the broken agreement. This is not mine, she said. Then she touched the pressed flower pendant, which Eleanor still held. Eleanor closed Emma's fingers. Around it. This is. Emma clutched the pendant like a lifeline. She looked at Caroline, not with hatred, but with a kind of grief. You could have had everything people think matters, but you still chose to take from people who had less than you. Caroline's face tightened. Do not lecture me. I am not, Emma said. I am reminding myself. Then she turned to Julian. For the first time all night, she allowed herself to meet his eyes fully. You asked who I was. I am Emma Bennett. I am not your bride. I am not your scandal. I am not the poor girl your world can pass around as evidence. Her voice trembled, but every word grew steadier. I made a terrible choice because I was afraid, but I will not let fear choose the rest of my life. The dining room blurred through her tears. She looked at Eleanor last, and this time even the proudest members of the Ashford family lowered their eyes. If anyone here truly loves him, love the man who knelt beside your chair, not the name above the gate. Do not let the woman who wanted power sit in the place where love should have been. And please, when you remember me, do not remember the dress. Remember that I told the truth before it was too late. Eleanor covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Julian's uncle wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. A server near the sideboard turned away, crying silently. Even Claire stood frozen, her folder pressed to her chest. Julian looked at Emma as if the room had fallen away and only those words remained. Emma gave one small nod, then walked out of the dining room, past the candles, past the portraits, past the wealth that had almost made her forget her own name. Julian took one step after her, but Eleanor caught his wrist. Not tonight, she whispered through tears. If you follow her now, you will only look like another man trying to buy forgiveness. Let her leave with the dignity she came back for. Outside the dining room, Emma stepped into the cold corridor alone, still wearing the borrowed gown, still with no money for Noah, but breathing as if the first honest air of her life had finally reached her lungs. 3 months later, Emma Bennett was tying a ribbon around a small bouquet of white violets when the bell above the flower shop door rang and the whole room seemed to forget its ordinary noise. The shop was narrow and warm, tucked between a bakery and a used bookstore on a quiet Boston street, with buckets of roses, tulips, and eucalyptus crowded near the windows. Outside, late afternoon rain turned the sidewalk silver. Inside, Emma wore a green apron over a simple blue dress, her honey blonde hair pinned back, her hands clean but faintly marked from stems and twine. She had rebuilt her days one honest hour at a time. She worked early mornings, visited Noah after lunch, delivered arrangements in the evenings, and every Friday she mailed a small payment toward the account Caroline's money had once touched, even though the hospital had reversed it before it cleared. No one demanded repayment. Emma did it because her name felt lighter each time she chose what fear had once stolen from her. Noah was healing now, slowly but truly. His surgery had been approved through the Eleanor Ashford Patient Relief Fund, a program Emma had not known existed until the hospital social worker explained it with paperwork, signatures, and strict rules that proved it was not Julian's private rescue disguised as charity. Eleanor had expanded the fund after that night, quietly, without cameras, to help families trapped between insurance delays and impossible deposits. Emma had cried in the hospital stairwell when she found out, not because a rich family had helped, but because the help had arrived without asking her to surrender her dignity. The bell rang again as the door closed behind Julian Ashford. For a moment, he stood just inside the shop with rain on the shoulders of his dark coat, looking far less like the billionaire from the Grand Hall and far more like a man unsure whether he had the right to step closer. Emma's fingers stilled on the ribbon. She had seen his name in articles since that night. Caroline Vale had disappeared from public events after Ashford Legal ended the engagement and quietly returned every disputed document to the hands of attorneys. There had been no scandal campaign, no public humiliation, only one short statement about a private family matter. Julian had kept his promise not to turn pain into spectacle. That mattered to Emma more than she wanted it to. "Miss Bennet," he said. Emma almost smiled. "You walked into a flower shop. Calling me Miss Bennet makes it sound like a board meeting." Something softened in his face. "Emma, then." "Julian." Her voice felt strange around his name, careful but not cold. He stepped forward and placed a small velvet box on the counter. Emma looked at it and immediately took one step back. Julian noticed and lifted his hands slightly. "It is not a ring." "Good," she said before she could stop herself. He gave a quiet laugh, the first real one she had heard from him. "I deserved that." He opened the box. Inside was her pressed flower pendant, repaired with a delicate new chain, the tiny white blossom cleaned and sealed again behind glass. Emma's breath caught. She touched her throat, where it had been missing for weeks. Eleanor had asked to borrow it after that night, promising only that it would come back when it was ready. Emma had not expected Julian to be the one carrying it. "My grandmother wanted to return it herself," he said. "But she is saving her strength for dinner tonight." Emma looked up. Dinner. A small one. No chandeliers full of strangers. No announcements. No contracts. His eyes held hers, steady and humble. "She asked me to invite you and Noah, if he feels well enough. She said there are some doors a family should open properly after closing them badly." Emma looked down at the pendant. The memory of that night moved through her, the borrowed gown, the candles, Caroline's smile, Eleanor's tears, her own voice saying she was not his bride, not his scandal, not evidence to be passed around by rich people. "Julian, I cannot be another project. You are not, and I cannot be paid into trusting you." "I know." His answer came without defense. He rested one hand lightly on the counter, not reaching for her, not claiming space she had not offered. "I did not come to buy back your trust. I came to earn it, one ordinary day at a time, if you allow me to try." The rain tapped softly against the window. Behind Emma, the cooler hummed. Across the street, a bus sighed at the curb. There was nothing grand about the moment, and maybe that was why it felt safe. Emma lifted the pendant from the box, and Julian helped fasten it only after she nodded. His fingers did not linger. The flower settled against her chest, small and familiar, like her mother had found her way back through glass and rain. That evening, Emma arrived at Ashford Estate in her own simple dress. Not white, not borrowed, not chosen by someone else. Noah came beside her with a careful step and a grin he tried to hide every time he saw something expensive. Julian met them at the door, not in a tuxedo, but in a gray sweater, nervous enough that Noah whispered, "Is the billionaire scared of you?" Emma whispered back, "He should be." Inside, Eleanor waited near the fireplace with a blanket over her knees and white violets in a vase beside her chair. When Emma approached, the old woman took both her hands. "This time," Eleanor said, her eyes shining, "you were not hired to walk into this family. You were invited." Emma looked at Julian, and he did not look away. There was no promise too large, no diamond too bright, no sudden ending pretending to fix everything. There was only a table set for four, warm light on the windows, Noah laughing softly at something Eleanor said, and the quiet beginning of trust where a lie had once tried to stand. Emma touched the pendant at her throat and sat down, not as a fake bride, not as a poor girl rescued by wealth, but as herself, with her name intact and her heart finally free to choose.